A 5-story apartment building at the crack of dawn. Hardly a military target. And yet, a residential part of southern Ukrainian Zaporizhzhia came under Russian fire twice today, leaving several residents dead and many more injured. A horrifying reminder of Russia's ruthlessness as war coverage had all but shifted to Ukraine's battleground gains. In the past weeks, Putin's troops have been pushed further and further out of occupied territories, with surprisingly bold criticism of Russia's military leadership growing louder by the day.
Gutted by Russian rockets. Here in Zaporizhzhia, rescue workers search the rubble for missing residents. Local officials say several people were killed, while more have been hospitalized. After the initial dawn attack, firefighters headed to the scene. But a second salvo sent locals running for cover, as well as rescue workers. President Zelenskyy condemned the strikes.
In Zaporizhzhia, after the first rocket strike today, when people came to pick apart the rubble, Russia conducted a second rocket strike. Absolute vileness, absolute evil. And there have been thousands of instances of this already. And there could be thousands more, unfortunately.
Locals were left reeling.
Why are they doing this to us? What are they trying to prove? Killing old people? Why? For what?
The attacks come as Ukraine continues to force Russian troops back in the south and east. With these Ukrainian troops in the Donbass telling French reporters that they were using shells captured from the Russians. With winter fast approaching, Kyiv seems determined to press its current advantage as long as it can.
And we can now bring in Dr. Jade McGlynn. She's a senior researcher at the Monterey Initiative in Russian Studies. Dr. McGlynn, welcome back to the day. Putin's troops, Kyiv moving backwards, with Ukraine pushing further and further into occupied territories. Are we at a turning point of the war?
We're certainly seeing the tide turning in the war. As you say, Ukraine's been liberating more and more of its territory, 400 square kilometers of Kherson region in a matter of days. And the Russian army, we've seen large numbers of surrendering. Clearly, it's quite unable to get itself together. And yet, while it's clear that Ukraine is in a relative to its earlier position, relatively strong position, it feels too soon to say exactly what this turning point might lead to, sort of what road we are turning into. I mentioned earlier in your report, we saw that Russia launched strikes on apartment blocks as people were sleeping in the city of Zaporizhzhia, which Russia claims as its own, despite not having de facto control. And then in light of Putin's comments later on in the day that the situation in these new territories, as he would call them, would stabilize, it's quite hard not to worry that this is an ominous portent of what is to come. And that's what always happens when Russia's on the back foot, as we've seen in Syria and in Chechnya and in Ukraine in 2014, that it reacts by fighting harder and uglier and with less concern for lives, its own and others.
These continued setbacks that we've been seeing over the past weeks have triggered an unprecedented wave of criticism towards Putin's top brass. I mean, the Russian-installed head of the occupied Kherson region even suggested the defense minister shoot himself. How much credibility is this costing Putin and his cronies?
So for Stromosov, the Russian-installed head of the Kherson region, to say that Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, should shoot himself is really just beyond remarkable to be witnessing this sort of breakdown in discipline. Normally, these sorts of collaborators, they do as they're told, they pretend everything's fine, but clearly that's no longer tenable. Things are at breaking point. So your question of credibility is a very pertinent one. Clearly, reality is starting to bite through the mirage, though I would say that it's perhaps still too soon to talk about it costing Putin directly. I think instead what we're going to see is criticism of officials and different people trying to blame different people, but not directly Putin.
Yeah. Another one of the very vocal critics of what is happening on the battlefield was the infamous Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov. He accused the Russian military of incompetence and nepotism, and he now claims that the Kremlin promoted him to general. What do you make of that?
It would appear that he has been promoted to general, which I think is probably a note of how much the Kremlin wants to keep Kadyrov inside the tent. But you're quite right that alongside Yevgeny Prigozhin, for example, founder of the Wagner group of the mercenaries, they've been ridiculing the generals, saying that the military is riddled with nepotism, that senior officers should be sent to the front to atone for their sins in blood. And in terms of their accusations of incompetence and nepotism, I'm actually for once of one mind with General Kadyrov. I think he's correct. The system that Putin's created in Russia is one that's riddled with incompetence, with cronyism, and that really has ended up making the system is Putin's own worst enemy. It's why the military isn't as modernized, and it's why the military is not doing as well, because clearly all that money didn't go on modernizing the army.
Yeah. Kadyrov has been pushing for a more drastic approach by the Russian army, openly pushing for the use of nuclear weapons, actually. With increasing battlefield losses, does that option become more likely, in your opinion?
The short and honest answer here is that I don't know. And I don't think we can ever be flippant about the use of nuclear weapons. Though that said, it's also not wise to sort of scaremonger or to be seen to give in to nuclear blackmail. So of course, it's an incredibly difficult one. I think so far what we've seen is that in general, if one stands up to Putin's threats without sort of being deliberately escalatory, then he tends to give in. So whether that's Sweden and Finland joining NATO, or Ukraine itself fighting back, or the US delivering HIMARS. So whilst Russia likes to bring up its nuclear superpower status, I don't think we should necessarily interpret that as a readiness to use nuclear weapons. I think if that was going to happen, that we would start to see certain activities rather than just language, and thank God we haven't seen that yet.
Yeah. In recent days, we've seen many Russian men who've been drafted as part of this mobilization complaining about the conditions they live in, that they're being sent into battle without a second even of training or instruction. I mean, that cannot be in the Kremlin's interest. Why is this mobilization so chaotic?
It is. It's incredibly chaotic. I mean, I even saw accounts today of men being told to go and buy bicycle helmets because there were no military helmets available and there were none even to buy. But I think the reason for the chaos is because the Russian state itself is so inefficient and sclerotic. Again, going back to that corruption we were just speaking about, the military, the bureaucracy, quite clearly is not capable of handling a large-scale mobilization of this kind, and that's where the chaos comes from.
Now, while all of this is happening, scores of Ukrainians continue to try and escape the war every day. And I want to talk about a specific group of them that is stranded in hostile Russia, trying to cross into EU country Estonia. How did they get there, and what's their situation? I know you've been following it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I've spent a fair amount of time in Pskov region, which is the region that borders Estonia. So I've been following this situation quite closely. There are, of course, very long queues, up to 5 days in horrendous and very cold conditions, which Pskov residents are trying to help with. But it's difficult. The delays come from the Russian side on the main. Some of the people in this queue, not all, but quite a lot of them are Ukrainian, and there's a large contingent from Mariupol, and they've ended up there largely after passing through so-called filtration camps, which they were checked, or because the only way to escape the shelling, the destruction of their city, was basically to flee into other areas of occupied Ukraine. And it's worth noting as well that under occupation in Mariupol, most Mariupol residents became convinced that there no longer is a Ukraine. So shut off are they from the outside world, that Kiev is in smithereens, that everything is destroyed, and that they might as well go to Crimea. Clearly learning that that's not the case, now quite a few of them are trying to get back to Ukraine via the EU, or at least just to leave Russia.
Desolate situation there. Dr. Jay McGlynn of the Monterey Initiative in Russian Studies. Always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, who's in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, for talks about security at Europe's biggest nuclear power station, precisely in Zaporizhzhia, is discussing plans for a safe zone after months of shelling near the facility. The plant is located near the front line in a southern Ukrainian region illegally annexed by Moscow. Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered his government to take formal control of the facility on Wednesday, but at a press conference in Kyiv, Grossi said it was, quote, obvious that the station remained a Ukrainian facility. And DW's Nick Connolly was at that press conference. Earlier, I asked him for more on what Rafael Grossi said.
Well, he had precious little detail to give away, at least in public for now. He said he would be heading to Moscow soon and then back to Kiev. He was trying to kind of spread optimism and make it clear that he has not given up on this idea of a safe zone, where there are currently two of his colleagues in Zaporizhzhia at any one time at the power station. There will soon be four. But, I mean, it's a drop in the ocean if you kind of consider quite how many people work at that power station, how big it is, and how major the challenges it faces are, given that, you know, this is Europe's biggest nuclear power station on the front lines with shelling going on around every day, basically. But there was definitely a sense the journalists wanted him to kind of take sides and to talk about kind of Russia's actions there, the Russians' attempts to take control of that power station. And obviously, given his UN remit and the fact he has to deal with the Russians on a daily basis if he wants access to that power station, he was keeping very clear, well clear of anything that could be construed as a kind of political statement.
Now, while Grossi was discussing Zaporizhzhia, Russian missiles hit Zaporizhzhia, killing several civilians there. Is there something to be read into the timing of this attack?
I think definitely Zaporizhzhia is one of the Russians' main targets. You know, they have illegally annexed that whole region just last week, but you know, the capital of that region is still not under their control. It is under Ukrainian control. So there's definitely a sense that they are trying to make things as difficult as possible for civilians in Ukrainian-controlled Zaporizhzhia to make, you know, life without power, without basic heating and other kind of supplies really desperate, to also put pressure on the Ukrainian authorities there. I wouldn't necessarily say it was timed to coincide with his visit, but there is no sense that Russia is somehow steering clear of that power station or doing anything that would kind of take away the risks that, you know, that region has been living with since the beginning of this war.
Now, we're talking a lot about the Ukrainian counteroffensive and how successful it's being. What's the latest on that?
We've heard from the Ukrainian military. They say that over the past week they have taken back about 400 square kilometers of territory in the Kherson region, which is not very far away from Zaporizhzhia, just across the Dnipro River. And we are seeing, you know, that Ukrainian offensive continuing. The details can trickle through to us quite slowly. The Ukrainian authorities are very careful to make sure that nothing operational gets out. But there's a lot of panic on Russian social media among military bloggers and people who support this war, and a sense that, you know, they might soon see a repeat of what happened in Kharkiv a couple of weeks ago with the kind of total collapse of Russian forces. They are basically out on a limb on the western bank of the Dnipro River with most of the bridges taken out of action. So they are really, really dependent on pontoon bridges and airlifts to get supplies in. So there is a sense here in Kiev that, you know, Ukraine's army is on a roll, and we are going to see more towns retaken by Ukraine and more successes in the next couple of days.
DW's Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Thank you so much.
DW's Matthias Berlinger is in Yuzhny in southern Ukraine, and I asked him earlier what he was hearing about Russian forces on the run from advancing Ukrainian troops.
We're hearing several stories of Russian forces either running away or surrendering to Ukrainian forces in several parts of the southern front. Ukraine has made big advances, especially in the Kherson region, that's just adjacent to the Zaporizhzhia region. And then every time when these things happen, the attacks on the civilian infrastructure, on the cities behind the front lines, on Ukrainian territory, Zaporizhzhia, as we've just seen today, where 7 rockets hit apartment blocks, or on Mykolaiv or Kharkiv, they increase. That's usually the response of the Russians when they start losing territory. It's a pattern that we've been observing for some time here.
Now, Russia has seized control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, and President Zelenskyy is accusing Moscow of nuclear blackmail, isn't he?
Yes, so the plant has been under Russian control for several months now. since the beginning of the war, effectively. But what has happened now is that Putin has now formally, as he signed a decree that incorporates it into the Russian state assets, and he has said that it would be run by Russia now. Now, what that means is not very clear, but it seems to be that the Ukrainian staff that is running this plant is being pressured to sign a new contract with the Russian Atomic Energy Authority. It's a very complicated scheme that has been allowed the plant to function or to be under more or less control, although there have been lots of problems where the Ukrainians would continue running it while the leadership has been brought in from Russia, and now as Russia has illegally, according to most countries' assessment, international law, annexed these territories, they are now claiming the station as part of their own. The Ukrainian side has told its engineers not to sign anything with the Russians, but this is, of course, a step of escalation, and that's why Zelenskyy called it nuclear blackmail, because the Russians being in control of this station and fighting going on around there is, of course, a dangerous situation.
If I could just ask you quickly, Russian special forces are said to have suffered significant casualties in the fight for the key city of Liman. How do you think that will affect the morale of all these newly mobilized Russian reservists?
It's definitely not going to enhance the trust in Russian capabilities. We hear a lot of information that the mobilization is not going well, very dire conditions for the new recruits, very bad preparation, and this is definitely not. This is definitely adding to it.
All right, Matthias Berlinger in Yuzhny in southern Ukraine. Thanks so much.